Hey, Tommy, why are auto manufacturers hell-bent on confusing car buyers with impossible car names?
It's a good point, Dad, because back in the day, car names were pretty easy. You had the Eldorados and the El Caminos and Toronados and all these fantastic names you could latch onto. But now, as we go through 2023, so many car manufacturers are going alphanumeric, and so many manufacturers are coming up with special editions and different versions that don't line up with tradition. So we're going to talk about that right now. We're going to start with the new Dodge Demon the Dodge Challenger SRT Demon 170. So obviously we know it's a Dodge Challenger,
Yep.
which means it's a two-door muscle car. SRT means it's fast. Demon, well, we've had a Demon, and we know that this one's faster than a Demon, so shouldn't it be Demon Extreme or something? What does 170 mean?
Yeah, it's a good start and a good example. I've heard a lot of explanation for it, and actually Nathan got to go to the launch, and so we actually know what the 170 means. And you would think that the 170 would mean the octane level because it runs on E85, right?
Yeah.
But it's like 185 is like 110, 120 octane, I think. The 170 stands for, get this, the alcohol.
The proof.
Exactly, in E85. And I don't know about you, Tommy, but I don't remember the last time I drank E85.
Yeah.
So I get what they were going for, but I think it's very confusing.
Yeah, it really is. And adding a random number at the end of a name
Yeah.
is pretty common nowadays, but oftentimes that number does not signify what you think it means. So for example, in the Cadillac lineup, if you get an Escalade and you see a 600 badge on the back of it, that doesn't mean 600 horsepower. That doesn't mean 600 pound-feet of torque. That means 600 Newton meters. So it's a really interesting thing where manufacturers oftentimes just add a number at the end, but don't give it a ton of meaning. And 170, yes, 170 does have meaning, but it's very confusing. But that is by far not the worst offender. To talk about confusing names, we're actually going to transition to BMW, which has one of the largest and most confusing lineups in the industry.
Yeah, once upon a time it was simple, right? You knew that a 3 Series was a small sedan, a 5 Series was a bigger sedan, and a 7 Series was even a bigger sedan. And then things went off the rails. Actually, it was more clever than that because you knew that like a 525i was a 5 Series with a 2.5 liter fuel injected engine. And
Yeah.
it made a lot of sense. And if it was an X at the end of it, it meant it was all-wheel drive. But now, Tommy, why don't you go through their lineup?
Well, it used to be that 2, 4, 6s, and 8s were two doors.
Right.
But now you can get a 4 Series, which should be a two-door, but as a 4-door with the Grand Coupe. So a 4 Series Grand Coupe is a two-door version of what used to be a 3 Series, right? And then with 4 doors, but it's not a 5 Series. So that's really confusing. And then you have X1, X3, X4, X5, X6, X7 SUVs.
Which made sense.
Makes a lot of sense. And then you had the M versions, the X5M, the X6M, and then they came out with a new model, the XM, which doesn't have a number in it at all. So is that similar to an X5M? Is it similar to an X6M? But it gets even weirder because in the M lineup, the word competition used to mean it was an extreme version. But the faster version of the XM is not the XM competition, but the XM red label.
And we haven't even gotten to the electrified ones.
Yeah, and the electrified ones make even less sense because, I means
Yep.
it's electric. I4, i7,
Yep.
that's great. And then iX. But for example, i4, you can get an M50 or a 440, or is it just 40? i440, I think is what it's called. But the 40 doesn't mean that it has 400 horsepower or a 4 liter because it's electric. It's just an arbitrary number that they put at the end of that lineup.
Yeah, the point here is if you're my wife or your mom, she's not going to have a clue as to what any of this means. If as automotive journalists that have spent the last 12 years driving every car in America, we're confused. Imagine like what the typical car buyer walking into a BMW dealership and like looking at a model, thinking to themselves, so is this an M or is this an M line? And why is this an XM? Shouldn't that be electric? You know what I mean? It's very complicated.
And then we get to Mercedes.
Oh my gosh,
Similar
Mercedes.
story. So A-Class, C-Class, E-Class, S-Class.
Once
Makes
upon a
ton of
time,
sense.
easy, yeah.
And then it still makes sense when you put an E in front of it for the electrified models. EQE, EQS. The SUVs also make sense on the gasoline side of things. So you have GLA, GLB, GLC, GLE, and GLS.
Yeah, so G once upon a time stood for basically the crossovers, and of course EQ stands for the electrified.
But now it's confusing because
Right.
if you want an SUV crossover, it's not like EGLE, it would be EQE SUV or EQS SUV.
And what if you wanted the AMG version of that?
Well, that would be the Mercedes AMG EQE SUV.
I know. I mean, that is just alphabet soup, dude. I can't believe that somebody in Stuttgart was like, "We're going to go with that."
And then you have manufacturers that have a little bit more sense in the lineup, like Infiniti and Genesis.
Okay.
So Genesis, right? G70, G80 sedans.
Right.
GX70, G80, oh my gosh.
I know that's the problem.
G70, G80 sedans, GV70, GV80 SUVs. Same thing with Infiniti, Q50, Q60, QX50, QX80, that kind of thing.
And now, like, just imagine those cars in your head, if you can. And I'll say one word, and I bet you will know exactly what car that is. Okay. Suburban.
Yeah, it's true.
You know what I mean? Mustang.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
911, right? These are iconic names that have over time established a reputation. And what's super frustrating is when, like Volkswagen took brands that, nameplates that were iconic, Golf, Passat, Jetta, and turned them into ID.
Well, Volkswagen did something cool because they named them after winds too, like Scirocco. You know, all these
Right.
exotic like weather patterns.
Yeah,
which was
Touareg.
really cool. And now we have the ID4 and the ID3, and then for some reason the ID Buzz, right? Like, just give them cool, fun names.
And to make it worse, I think they did this thing where like the ID4 came out in front of the ID1. They just announced it doing an ID2 and an ID1 in Europe, right? And imagine if like the iPhone came out and it was like, hey, the iPhone 10 is out, but I'm going to go get myself an iPhone 7.
Well,
it makes no sense.
The idea is when they have the full lineup,
Right.
it's going to make sense. An ID4 is going to be bigger than a 3, but smaller than a 5. That's kind of the idea. But currently, because they did not come out in order, it's a little confusing. Similar to Hyundai with the Ioniq 5, right? They started with 5. And then the Ioniq 6 you'd expect to be bigger, but it's actually a sedan, whereas the 5 is a crossover. So that's confusing. Where Hyundai does really well is their city names: Kona, Santa Fe, Santa Cruz, Kia with the Telluride, Hyundai with the Palisade. You know, these are names that you can really grasp onto that make a ton of sense. And then we have interesting ones like Cadillac, where they have alphanumeric CT4, CT5, and then they use fantastic names like the Blackwing. But you know, why can't we return to the days of the Eldorados and that kind of thing? That would be a really great return.
Yeah, and I think the best and worst example of this is Toyota, right? Toyota has a lot of classic and I think
Iconic.
iconic nameplates, right? So Corolla, right? The longest, most produced car in history.
Camry, you know.
Yeah. And then when they did their electric car, they came out with what, Tommy?
BZ4X.
All right. And in the comments below, I'm curious to know how many of you know what BZ4X stands for. So I'm going to give you a little second to write that down before Tommy tells us what that alphabet soup exactly means.
It's pretty funny because in the press launch of this car,
Yeah.
most of the journalists didn't know either. We actually had to ask what it meant because it actually means something.
Okay.
So Toyota's moving to this new nomenclature, Beyond Zero,
Yep.
for their electrified models. Beyond Zero shortened BZ.
Right.
4 is going to be the size of the vehicle, and then X signifies that it's a crossover. So in theory, there's going to be like a BZ3 and a BZ7X. Not actual cars, but maybe they will be one day.
So the cool thing about that would be if you were like really into Toyotas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're really into Jeeps, right? And we know what a JK is and a JL, right? Then kind of the model designation that the manufacturer uses becomes kind of this shorthand for people who know, you know, same thing with BMW, right?
Yeah, or like Porsche, like 993, 996.
Or even Mercedes, right?
Yeah, like the W114,
Right. Yeah. So
W115.
that becomes, but you don't make that the actual name of the car because I think most people who walk into the dealership will be like, "What? A BZ4? How come it's sitting next to a Camry?"
Yeah. I struggle with that a lot. And I wish that we would just go back to good tactile names spelled out on the back of a car. Wouldn't that be cool?
But they're also messing those up. I'll give you an example, right?
Uh-huh.
This is also kind of frustrating. So obviously, Mustang.
Sure.
Great. I love it, right? People know what it's been around since 67 and a half, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it 66?
64 and a half.
64 and a half, yeah. But how about the Mustang Mach-E? Now you're taking two cars and trying to conflate them.
Right.
The other example of that would be Bronco and Bronco Sport.
Sure, and that caused a lot of confusion. So Ford actually got the Bronco Sport to the streets quicker than the full-size Bronco, and there was this huge trend on Instagram of Jeep guys saying, "Wow, look at this new Bronco, it's terrible." They were talking about the baby Bronco Sport, not the full-size Bronco. And Ford has typically had some really good names, like everything that starts with an E in the Ford lineup has historically been an SUV: Explorer, Expedition, Edge, Escape. But they're losing it a little bit trying to really capitalize on these brands.
Yeah, and I think the one brand that has probably been the poster child for this has to be Infiniti, right? Because Infiniti started with...
Well, Infiniti was always a mess.
Right, it started with...
Like J?
FX? Was FX first?
No, I think it was
J?
I think it was J.
J, then they went to FX.
Well, FX was their SUVs,
and
right?
now it's Q.
Oh, they also had the M's, right? And the G's, and then the I's. And now they're trying to simplify everything with being Q. So like the Qs are the sedans, QX is the SUV. But the issue with Infiniti, as you just pointed out, is if you don't have a lineage of sticking to the same names, you end up with a ton of confusion and not a lot of brand awareness. Like if I say the word QX55 right now, do you know exactly what I'm talking about? You probably don't. But if I say the word Escape, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I say the word Durango, right, that, boom, immediately I know what a Durango is.
Yeah, and I think with Infiniti what happened was like a new CEO came in and, when you hire a new CEO, he's got to make some big changes. So an easy change to make is, we're no longer going with Q, we're going with, M. Or we're no longer going with M, we're going with QX.
So what do you think of like Ford, where they take the word Maverick, which in the 70s was, a car, and applying it to a little truck? Do you think that matters, or do you think people understand?
I think people understand.
That's old enough where like it's been...
Yeah. I think you're playing with fire, though, because in the Dodge world, the Hornet, which, actually started out as it wasn't a Chrysler product, right? It was, the first Hornet was...
that was
Was
the...
it Studebaker?
No.
Was
You're
it?
thinking of the Hudson.
Yeah, it was a Hudson. Yeah. So it started out as a Hudson, right? And so I think there you're... And a good example of this would be the Dart, right? The Dart wasn't the grand car when it first came out, and I think what they thought was, we'll take this classic nameplate and we'll add it to a modern car, and because the modern car wasn't that great, the name didn't really suit it.
It was an AMC as well.
AMC, yeah.
AMC had a lot of good names. The Eagle was a really good name.
Yeah.
Matador. They had a lot of good names. Pacer, Gremlin.
Yeah.
They were really fun, actually.
And maybe that's the reason. Maybe all the good names are taken.
Yeah, that is a lot of it, actually. Oh, I was just talking to someone. I was just talking to one of the product planners at Toyota about how manufacturers name their colors. And someone will come up with a great name, and they'll immediately look, and they'll be like, oh, that name's taken. Then someone will come up with another great name, oh, that name's taken. And they basically have to go down the list until they can find a name for a color that has not been already, used. And there's all sorts of interesting rules around this. Like a manufacturer can only hold a nameplate so long before it expires and then goes public. So, for example, Jeep had the trademark to Willys or Willis,
Right.
and they had to bring it back in 2000, like the mid 2000s of the Wrangler, because that nameplate was about to expire if they didn't use it. So interesting rules around that as well.
Yeah, and Jeep does a really good job with their names, I think.
I think for the most part, they do.
Anytime you go alphanumeric, I think, especially now, you've gone that is going so far off the reservation. And I think Audi this week made some news where they're saying they're going back to real names, right?
That's just cool.
Which is cool. And I think hopefully the pendulum has swung. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked about, which is actually the one stable element that works, are trucks, right?
Yeah.
Trucks, Silverado, F series, right? And then you go F-150, F-250, F-350, HD trucks, 1,500, 2,500, 3,500. I think that makes sense. And the second I said those, you could picture those in your mind.
But do you think there's an argument to be made there that like the numbers don't signify what they used to?
Yeah, I mean,
a quarter ton used to be able to call a quarter ton.
And a half ton, and a 3/4 ton. But that's because capability has expanded so much. But the numbers still work. And people understand them. So, I think that the manufacturers are making, for great videos for us, but not for great sales for their product. Because I think if you walk into any Mercedes dealership or a BMW dealership today, you're just going to be completely overwhelmed. And most people, I'm not talking about us because we have to know this thing. Oh, that's another good example. Why is the Taycan a turbo?
Yeah, like the Porsche Taycan Turbo, right?
Or Turbo S. I understand that once upon a time, a 911 Turbo had a turbo, and a Turbo S meant that it had more power, but there's no turbo in a Taycan.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all electric.
Right. And there's an argument to be made that, like, Porsche, for example, the Cayenne, does a pretty good job of describing exactly what it is. So, for example, let me find a good one, and I don't want to mess up the name, so maybe it's not that good of an example, but like the E-hybrids. Here's a good one. The Cayenne Turbo S, so you know it's a Cayenne, you know it's a turbo, you know it's an S, so it's a fast turbo.
Yep.
E-hybrid,
Coupe.
so you know it's a hybrid and coupe, so you know
It's
that
got
it's
4 doors.
Yeah, it's got the slanting back, though. I mean, it's not perfect, but at least you know what you're getting into, a Cayenne Turbo S E-hybrid coupe.
Yeah, and I think part of this came with, that's a great example where the manufacturers, especially the Germans, they will leave no category uncontended, right?
Yeah.
So if Porsche builds a slant back coupe, and I'm using air quotes here, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then Mercedes has to do it, and BMW has to
And
do it.
Audi has to do it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Even though it has nothing to do with a coupe because it's got 4 doors.
Yeah.
And so they've kind of painted themselves into a corner, and hopefully in the next 10 years they'll paint themselves out of a corner. And the crazy thing is, with electrification, it's like a clean sheet of paper. You can start all over again. And I think the company that's done this really well is Tesla. They only have 4 cars, right?
Yeah.
But they're easy, right? You know exactly what a Model X, Y, S, and which one did I forget?
3.
3 is, no problem.
Yeah.
And the Cybertruck is very easy. And that's because, of course, Mr. Musk wants to spell sexy cars out. It's a goofy reason, but it works.
Sure, we'll give it to him. Why not?
And if you don't know what I'm talking about, leave it in the comments and let the other people know what I'm saying about sexy cars.
Yeah, and guys, if you have any other great examples, we'd love to hear them in the comment section below. There's a ton we've missed, but this has been Tommy.
And Roman saying thanks for watching. Remember, hey, if you want to listen to our podcast,
Yep.
Head on over to any of your favorite podcast platforms.
Oh, yeah.
Because Tommy does a great classics car podcast, and me and Nathan get together and talk about new cars. And we'd love to have you join us there because those podcasts come out every week. And you can also find them at alltfl.com.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your insight. All right, thanks, guys.
Ciao.